It's a pleasure to be here in Roscommon. I was here officially about 13 or 14 years ago, and I must say the river outside it reminded me a little bit. It's running very fast and very high, and that was the era of flooding in December 2009, and people like Terry and Michael Finneran were taking me around the place. And of course, I had the honour of working, as has been mentioned, for a Roscommon-born man, Albert Reynolds, and indeed I had the honour of writing quite a lengthy entry on him for the Dictionary of National Biography, which is free online. And of course, I'm very conscious also of the fact that this is a county associated in different ways with two presidents, Douglas Hyde or Dehida, and of course, nowadays, former President McAleese. I'm delighted to be here with former colleagues, Terry Leyden, though he and I be sitting on a committee together, coming to the future, and Deputy John Connor. Ladies and gentlemen, as someone who has always been very fond of Percy French in all sorts of ways, I would like to thank Kevin Finnerty for giving me this opportunity to pay tribute to Percy in his native county. Kevin and Teresa deserve great credit for restoring this heritage house over the past 20 years and more, and making it an asset for Roscommon tourism and for organising this annual festival, which I think has been running now for about 15 years, which honours the memory of one of Roscommon's highest achievers. Kevin has also served the wider cause. Our daughter-in-law, Aoife O'Driscoll, was recalling for me 2 days ago times when she represented Passcourt, where she worked, at board meetings of the organisation Houses, Castles and Gardens of Ireland, where she met Kevin. Percy French was an extraordinarily gifted and witty writer and performer, maintaining a high quality from beginning to end, and yet self-deprecating with a great way of gently puncturing bombast and pretension, beginning with himself and what he called his descendancy background. His ballads, many of them legendary, have endured, and they relate to all parts of the country, including a County Limerick village, Drumcolliher, which perhaps one day King Charles might take up the invitation to visit, first delivered in song at least to Buckingham Palace in the reign of Edward VII. And Edward VII visited Ireland 4 times in a reign of only 9 years, where ironically he laid the foundations of what has become government buildings. French's watercolour paintings, and I saw a few more in the French room in the house just a few moments ago, of which we possess 2, are attractive and restful. And I was delighted to find several more on a visit earlier this year to the Cavan County Museum in Ballyjamesduff. In addition to all that, remarkable new evidence has been brought to light to suggest that French was a profound influence on James Joyce's last work, Finnegan's Wake, and even key to its understanding. On my side, there is also a family connection. The first cousin of my grandmother became a singer and co-founded with his wife Fanny Moody the Moody Manners Opera Company, whereupon he substituted a simple artistic name, Charles Manners, for the cumbersome one he was born with, Southcote Manser. He performed when he was a young man with Percy French, both engineers by profession. I will come back to that later. There were many historical, political and economic reasons for wanting Irish independence, and brought out by Luke Gibbons in the previous talk, some of them. But there is an argument for saying that the driving force in the early 20th century was cultural, as represented by a combination of the Gaelic League and the literary revival. Was Ireland a nation, and if so, was it not entitled to a national life of its own? To avoid that conclusion, Carson maintained Ireland was a country, not a nation. The same argument lies behind Russian aggression against Ukraine, that Ukraine is not a nation. One could argue that the effort to establish a national life goes back well before 1922, but certainly this part of Ireland has had one since, incomplete in many respects, and an ongoing work in progress with both successes and setbacks along the way, the experience common to most countries. We should be critical, but not overly judgmental, given all the difficulties involved at the time. The challenges evolve, and the nature of national identity along with it. As a country becomes more successful, this may create a wider range of possibilities and responses, as well as a recognition that where we are at the moment is the product of many different strands rather than just a single approach. The cultural vision behind independence was only partially realised. There was and still is a tension between emphasising what is distinctive and even unique about Ireland and national political unity with those, many of whom who do not share that enthusiasm and who left to themselves strongly prefer to stay part of the union with Great Britain. Of course, we are apt to lose sight of the fact that severance, whether between the two parts of this island or between independent Ireland and Great Britain, bore no comparison with the near impenetrable barriers between the two Koreas, the two Germanys between 1961 and 1989, or the two parts of Cyprus. The Irish churches, many sporting bodies and institutions like the Royal Irish Academy, as well as various ad hoc organisations, are island-wide. And soon after 1949, when Ireland became a republic and left the Commonwealth, an arrangement known as the Common Travel Area carried on bilaterally the rights enjoyed by Irish citizens hitherto as a member of the country being a member of the Commonwealth, creating, among other things, a common employment market, which did not apply to the same extent in Northern Ireland, as well as a shared sporting and cultural sphere in addition to what was absolutely distinct. In many ways, partition removed many of the obstacles to complete separation, with the opposition to an Irish Ireland mostly on the other side of the border. Nonetheless, the early decades of the Irish Free State and then the Republic showed up the limitations of a programme of self-containment and self-sufficiency, warding off the perceived negative influences of a supposedly decadent Western civilization. A great effort was put into trying to make Ireland a mainly Irish-speaking country, which was initially the main educational priority. The difficulty was persuading the people to embrace the project, which, if successful, would have cut off the option of emigration, even if there was, and still is, a lot of support for saving and promoting the language, including nowadays radio and TV, and great enthusiasm to this day for Irish music, holidays in the Gaeltacht, and the biggest success of all, probably, Gaelic games. There was a contradiction between extolling the culture of our islands and having, as in the case of the Blaskets, to evacuate them. In the post-war world, there was a tremendous pull factor coming from Britain, needing to engage in a vast post-war economic and social reconstruction, making it difficult for this small island in then prevailing conditions to compete and offer comparable opportunities. And agriculture as the main economic sector was not capable of delivering sufficient employment or wealth gains, and of course we didn't have free access even to the British market. They regulated it according to their interests rather than ours. The new state had problems with the absence of suitable cultural models. Many of the most prominent literary and artistic figures were used to a good deal of freedom and had ideas of their own, which they did not care to submit to political or de facto religious censorship. Synge and O'Casey, arguably through too much realism, had occasioned riots before and after the Revolution, leading O'Casey to emigrate to England. Cosgrave may have nominated Yeats a senator and put him in charge of design of the currency, but for De Valera, Yeats and his ilk were politely described as, quote, less characteristically Irish. even though his brother Jack B. Yeats, the painter, was a supporter of Fianna Fáil, of which William's son Michael became a senator and later MP and was an influential member. Daniel Corkery tried to make out that Synge could not be considered Irish at all, being not, inverted commas, racy of the soil, and privately he fretted about the excessive praise given to Thomas Davis, son of a British soldier, as indeed was Tom Clarke, if he'd cared to think about it. The assassination of Edith Somerville's relative, Admiral Somerville in West Cork in 1936, for helping boys make application to the Royal Navy was an outrage. But the problem was not only with what the French called the ci devant. Flann O'Brien was sacked from his civil service job in the Custom House at the behest of a Fianna Fáil minister. Luckily, as Ireland was struggling economically in the late 1950s with the population sunk to its lowest level ever, a new European constellation began to appear over the horizon. A lot of the uncompromising positions that had underpinned Ireland's development since political independence had to be fundamentally rethought, including what had been cast aside. Sean Lemass had to acknowledge, for example, the contribution made by Lady Gregory, who had at least become nationalist. There were others of whom I will talk today, of whom that could not always be said. And instead of politically polarized cultural and identity debates which maximize difference, there is a vast amount of cultural ground somewhere near the middle, often neglected, much of which could be revived and shared. Any united Ireland in the future will include a lot more Irish people who have had successful careers in a British context. Indeed, some of whom, like my father, will have been honoured for their work. A mix of people, some of whom have had a lot of valuable experience abroad, which could be of benefit here, should generally speaking be regarded as an asset, not a ground of objection or exclusion or mockery. The purpose of this address is to locate Percy French and other writers and artists similarly situated, all of whom contributed to Ireland's heritage and self-image in the cultural landscape of today. One of the literary injunctions I remember from school is the motto of E.M. Forster's Howard's Way, published, I think, in 1913, "Only connect." And tenuous connections between the writers, artists, and performers I shall be talking about will help provide me with a guiding thread. I've entitled this address Outside the Pantheon, so I would like to explain what I mean, beginning with a related metaphor, also religious, from the political sphere about some of the state's founders. 2023 is the final year of the decade of centenaries. And just by way of background, I've been honoured to be at the invitation of Enda Kenny when he was Taoiseach Deputy Chair, working with Maurice Manning on the expert advisory group. But this decade has run since 2012, covering the formative events a century ago that have shaped this island to the present day. The decade, a dozen years actually, covered from the time of the Home Rule crisis and the Ulster Covenant through the Easter Rising, and culminating in independence, partition, civil war, and the establishment of the Irish Free State, which was admitted to the League of Nations in September 1923. The centenary commemoration of all these and many more events, such as the Dublin lockout of 1913 and granting women's right to vote from 1918, has been very different in character from the 50th anniversary of the Rising commemorated in 1966, when veterans of the Rising such as President De Valera and Taoiseach Sean Lemass still dominated Irish life. At that time, there was only one national narrative. It was what one Jesuit priest, Father Francis Shaw, called the canon of Irish history, the canon being the books chosen in early Christian centuries for inclusion in the Bible. The target of Father Shaw's criticism was what he saw as the messianic attempt by Patrick Pearse to equate a version of advanced Irish nationalism with the Passion of Christ, one of his essays carrying the title The Four Gospels of Nationalism, being the writings of Tone, Davis, Lawler and Mitchell. And the metaphor carries over into the name normally given to the rebellion in 1916, the Easter Rising. And, to be fair, the Good Friday Agreement provided, with another resonant name, provided the other bookend to the 20th century in Ireland. Shaw's article was not published in Studies till 6 years later in 1972, posthumously at the height of the Troubles, for fear it might give offence. The core of Shaw's critique was that the ideology of the 1916 Rising narrowed down credit for the achievement of Irish independence exclusively to the Fenians and separatists, giving none to the constitutionalists or any other tradition, and that it honoured one group of Irishmen by denying honour to others whose merit was not less. The more recent commemorations of the last 12 years have tried to be inclusive, accepting that there are many narratives that need to be heard and taken account of. My concern today is not so much the validity or otherwise of Shaw's thesis, but simply to use his central concept to inquire whether there is a parallel concept, even if not explicitly formulated, a canon of Irish culture reflecting an ideal diligently sought after but not satisfactorily found, particularly in the early decades of the state. The second metaphor that I will use is the Pantheon. Now, the Pantheon, dedicated to the gods, is virtually the only fully intact temple in Rome, dating from the time of the Emperor Hadrian. It has to be remembered that most of the early Roman emperors were regarded as divinities in their own lifetime, like Nero, exquisitely played by Peter Ustinov in the film about early persecuted Christianity, Quo Vadis. French revolutionaries, whose minds were filled with classical models, most evident in the art of Jacques-Louis David, decided to create a pantheon of their own. They converted a vast church in Paris, l'Église de Sainte-Geneviève, built in thanksgiving for the recovery from a life-threatening illness of Louis XV in 1744, and began with inhuming the remains of two famous philosophes, Voltaire and Rousseau, and other immortals, i.e. great men then and to come in the Pantheon. A fully secularized building, even if on second thoughts Robespierre wanted to create a new religion out of the cult of reason. Under the Restoration, it temporarily went back to being a church. Courtiers urged Louis XVIII to remove Voltaire for being anti-clerical. It will be recalled that when Voltaire was dying, his family sent a priest to him who urged him to renounce the devil. But Voltaire objected that this was no time to be making new enemies. The king replied, "Leave him alone. He is sufficiently punished by having mass said over him every day." Later people given a resting place in the Panthéon include famous writers such as Alexandre Dumas, Victor Hugo, and Émile Zola, the scientists Pierre and twice Nobel Prize winner Marie Curie, as well as the French resistance leader Jean Moulin. And strong rumor had it in the 1980s and early 1990s that President François Mitterrand wanted to be buried there too, but an objective case was not successfully made. Two politicians of the last 100 years are buried there. The great socialist leader, Jean Jaurès, assassinated on the eve of the First World War, and Holocaust survivor and Speaker of the Assemblée Nationale, Simone Weil. Ireland does not have a pantheon in the physical sense. There may be a case for saying that in the field of literature particularly, there are a handful of writers, poets, playwrights, and a novelist who are constantly quoted and referred to as if they did belong in a pantheon. Their merits are not really an issue. Unfortunately, we do not have to decide whether they or which others would belong in a pantheon, perhaps because, in part, like the canon of Irish history, such distinctions are invidious. In any case, reputations go up and down, and each generation adds people whose fresh achievements in many fields become well known, both at home and abroad, and there is a certain displacement effect. In the rest of this talk, I would like to focus on people, some of whom would be very well known even today, and others less well remembered, if at all, who for a variety of reasons would be excluded from any pantheon, but bearing in mind that even the most eligible, as happened in France, would be heavily contested in some quarters. Let us begin in France with an indisputable and very famous genius whom scandal would have kept a million miles away from any Irish pantheon, and whose family had to change their name both to avoid disgrace by association as well as a host of practical difficulties like being refused a hotel booking because of their name. In 2016, I visited a first-rate exhibition in the Petit Palais off the Champs-Élysées on Oscar Wilde, which focused particularly but not exclusively on his final years after release from Reading jail, before he died in 1900 in much reduced circumstances and isolation in Paris. As he wrote to a friend, he was dying beyond his means. There is a story that he found the wallpaper in the bedroom to which he was confined hideous, and exclaimed that either it or he would have to go. His grave in the Bagneux Cemetery in Paris has often had to be repaired, like Flora MacDonald's on the island of Skye, because of the habit of visitors taking or prizing off small souvenirs. My feelings on leaving the exhibition were mixed. Admiration for the French for having done such a fine job with no hang-ups, and indignation that, as far as I knew, no exhibition on Wilde had ever been mounted in Ireland. The following year, to be fair, Trinity College did mount an exhibition based on materials that had been donated to it a few years earlier, but it was done without much fanfare. There are, of course, other forms of recognition. The large, recumbent and colourful statue of Oscar Wilde across the road from his parents' house in 1 Merrion Square is a favourite backdrop for photographs of visitors. Over many decades, the management of the Gate Theatre, especially at the time that it was run by the Edwards-MacLearmore Partnership, staged productions of his scintillating plays. Micheál MacLearmore's most famous one-man show, which I first saw during a festival week in my last term at school in King's Canterbury in July 1965, The Importance of Being Oscar, was a brilliantly entertaining account of Wilde's entire life. I was to lunch laid on for MacLearmore, and at that time I introduced myself to him as Anglo-Irish. He responded immediately that that was a term we must get rid of. And he was right in terms of nationality, though it may be a legitimate description of a cultural tradition. I noticed with some amusement in this morning's Irish Times that when Cecil Day Lewis was appointed a poet laureate in 1967, he claimed that he was the first Anglo-Irishman appointed to the job and described it as a feather in the cap for the old sod. I did not realise at the time, of course, the complications of MacLearmore's own constructed identity. Yesterday I was looking at 3 faces of him by Muriel Brandt, painted in 1966 in the National Gallery's exhibition of RHA women artists over the past century. Wilde's still somewhat uncertain place in Irish culture is not entirely attributable to his once inadmissible notoriety and lifestyle, or indeed his family background. His mother, with the pen name Speranza, was a patriotic poetess. His father, Sir William Wilde, was a well-respected public figure and a doctor who had tried to counteract some of the medical epidemics consequent upon the famine, in particular an ophthalmic disease causing blindness among the young. Indeed, one of my own family's properties near Tipperary, Newtown Cottage, was turned over to an auxiliary workhouse where sufferers could be kept separate and be treated successfully. Oscar Wilde, while not political, had leanings that were more nationalist than unionist. However, like many Irish writers before him from the 17th century on, his work was mostly set in or around London, the capital of the United Kingdom, to which, of course, Ireland then belonged, where the largest audience was to be found and the rewards for success were greatest. This, of course, did not exclude, as time went on, tours further afield, especially to the United States. Naturally, a close attention could pick up some Irish references. For example, doing a Bunbury, as in The Importance of Being Earnest, was a euphemism for using the excuse of a fictional sick aunt of that name down the country who required an urgent visit as a means of evading tiresome social obligations. As it happens, the real Bunbury family, or some of them, lived 2 miles away from us in Kilfeacle off the Tipperary-Cashel Road. And indeed, in 1860, Sarah Mansergh from a Cork branch of our family married a Captain George Bunbury from a Nina branch of theirs. Staying in France for the moment, Nobel Prize winner Samuel Beckett, born in Foxrock into a Protestant professional family, educated in Portora in the north and cricket playing, lived most of his adult life in France and becoming a member of the resistance during the occupation. He became famous for his modernist dramas, but would have been slow to be admitted to any Irish pantheon, with some ready up to this day to cast doubt as to whether he was really Irish in anything other than a very atypical sense. Obviously, he had very little in common with the ideals of Irish Ireland at the height of literary censorship. Nevertheless, in recent times, he has had a bridge, a university theatre, and a naval vessel named after him. And the Gate Theatre has performed the complete canon of his plays. And of course, he is one of the 4 Irish Nobel Prize winners for literature, along with Yeats, Shaw, and Heaney, winning his in 1969. Is his dramatic output produced abroad, some of it originally in French? That is, notwithstanding the names of some of his vagrant characters, not about Ireland or indeed any specific place in most cases, really to be regarded as outside our cultural framework or universe of discourse. Those who still snipe at Beckett from an Irish perspective do so in part from the vantage point of Theresa May's maxim that a citizen of the world is a citizen of nowhere. The alternative viewpoint, which is my own, is that there are many ways and many places on earth where Irish people can contribute to the welfare of humanity while reflecting well on the country of their roots, whether they reference it or not. Indeed, one of Seamus Heaney's great achievements was the translation of the Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf. Beckett crossed my desk on 2 occasions. A few days after the IRA broke their ceasefire in February 1996, I received what I regarded as a somewhat triumphalist message from a well-known London-based commentator from Ireland. She was actually on television last night, but that's another story, who was a strong critic of the peace process and sympathetic to Ulster Unionism and the Orange Order. The message was encapsulated in a partial quotation from Samuel Beckett's Worstward Ho, an injunction next time, quote, to fail better. A quotation that I had not come across before. No mention of the try again, fail again. That same person once warned me, because of my role as a back channel to the leadership of the Republican movement prior to the ceasefire, that when the revolution came, I would be the first to be shot. Despite the shortcomings of the Good Friday Agreement, 25 years on, it has weathered better than a much more famous peace agreement, the Treaty of Versailles. 25 years on from 1919, Europe was in the midst of the Second World War, which had even greater casualties in terms of millions. The second occasion was soon after my appointment as Minister of State with special responsibility for the arts in 2008. At the time when Beckett's Waiting for Godot was touring the country, and my senior minister, Martin Cullen, suggested it might be a good idea to attend at all the different venues. As I recall, I saw it twice. The second time in the Simon Ryan Theatre at the XL Heritage Centre in Tipperary, and I did appreciate it more than when I originally saw it about 20 years previous to that. However, Waiting for Godot is not Mozart's Marriage of Figaro, which I've seen many times, at least 3 times in Vienna when I was a student on a gap year in 1965-6, and many times since, always with pleasure. Beckett, in his younger days in Paris, was an amanuensis of James Joyce. When nearly blind, he was writing Finnegan's Wake. It is a work beyond the ken even of most Joyceans, and reading it a task that makes penetrating the thicket surrounding Sleeping Beauty seem easy by comparison. I was impressed to discover that Elizabeth Bowen claimed to have read it twice soon after its publication, and my suspicion is that she had much more time for Joyce than she had for Yeats. One of her critics has described her as an ascendancy modernist, like the painter Mamie Jellett. What is even more impressive is the groundbreaking work of Bernadette Lowry in decoding the leitmotif behind Finnegan's Wake as a form of homage to Percy French, whose short-lived editorship of the comic magazine The Jarvey in 1890-91, almost entirely forgotten about 50 years later, and subsequently provided Joyce with both a model and a quarry. Bernadette Lowry's Sounds of Many Mirth on the Night's Ear ringing Percy French 1854 to 1920, his Jarvey years, to which I provided an afterword and now awaiting a second edition, is a monument to the contribution of independent scholarship, including the connections that can be made by unusual combinations of interests and expertise. Her contribution is still being digested with as yet only limited acknowledgement and acclaim, but her inferences and conclusions, as far as I know, have not been seriously contested. While Joyce's work is universally acclaimed today, and especially his detailed evocation of Dublin in the early 1900s, past attitudes were far more mixed. Although undoubtedly nationalist in outlook, as his strongly Parnellite attitude in the 1890-91 split vouchsafes, he did not align himself with any political movement. He chose to live and write abroad. He kept a British passport for practical reasons, given where he was living. And of course, he paid little heed to conventional morality or pieties. And the principal character of Ulysses, Leopold Bloom, came from Ireland's smallest minority, the Jewish community, a good vantage point from which to observe the rest of society with an ironic eye, with the younger Joyce as Stephen Dedalus at his side. But I'm going to have every intention of updating my sketchy knowledge of Joyce and politics with the book on Joyce in 1916 by our previous speaker. Many people and places in Dublin have links with Ulysses. My family has two, one slight and entirely coincidental, the other more significant. Both relate to music. Some years after Liz and I moved into a house off Killiney Hill Road called Wilmot, built around 1873, the rector expressed surprise that we did not know that our house had once been inhabited by members of the Dubedat family. Frank E. Dubedat, like many of Huguenot origins such as the Latouches, reached the summit of high finance when he became chairman of the Irish Stock Exchange in September 1890, but 2 months later his fall, even more precipitate than that of Parnell, saw him hastily depart the country, having misappropriated clients' funds, in part at least to build himself a huge mansion at the top of St George's Avenue in Killiney. His deserted wife and children were housed in Wilmot by their father Samuel Waterhouse, a well-known jeweller. Frank had a cousin, first cousin, Marie Dubedat, who was a well-known singer in Dublin in the 1880s and much of the 1890s. And Joyce, when he was composing Ulysses, had to hand Tom's directory for 1904, noticed two Mrs. Dubedat listed in Killiney, and mistakenly assumed that Marie Dubedat, who was brought up in the South Circular Road, was from Killiney. The current issue of History Ireland has a short piece on this subject entitled Joyce's Huguenots. Anyway, she wasn't the Dubedat in question. Her first cousins, once removed and of a younger generation, were. And Joyce also had a Dorky connection in that both he and Stephen Dedalus taught briefly in a house called Summerfield, which still stands on Dorky Avenue. Another teacher lived there in the 1980s and early 1990s, a school friend of my wife Liz called Erica, godfather to our daughter Alice. The cultural world in Ireland of the late 19th and early 20th centuries consisted of many elements, and not just those of, on the one hand, the Gaelic League and the Irish Ireland movement, and on the other hand, the cultural revival and the Anglo-Irish literary renaissance. both of which anticipated at least a full-blooded Home Rule Ireland, if not more, when circumstances permitted. As Benjamin Franklin once said back in the 17th century, he was asked what was the best form of government, a republic if you could get it. Many of our national cultural institutions date from well before independence, not predicated any more than those in Scotland or Wales on a future change in political or constitutional status of the countries they were located in. Culturally speaking, public entertainment before the era of the screen or the radio consisted of companies and performances that in many cases toured these islands, often but not always with an Irish dimension both as part of the programme and amongst the performers. Even post-independence, for economic as well as other reasons, Irish artists, writers and performers sought work and recognition beyond this island in London, Edinburgh, New York and Paris and beyond, facilitated by the opening up and speeding up of travel and communications. Their work was not always centred on Ireland. I've just finished Colm Tóibín's The Master about Henry James, the American writer, mostly set in America, England and Italy, and only a little in Ireland. Kate O'Brien's magnificent novel, That Lady, is set in the Spain of Philip II, and about his relationship with the Princess Eberli, portrayed altogether differently from her action and character in Verdi's opera Don Carlos. Percy French, Bernard Shaw, the Moody Manners Opera Company, William Orpen, and indeed Sir John Lavery, whose studio was a meeting place for the Irish treaty delegation, where the magnetic Canadian-born Lady Lavery acted the hostess. They all operated across country boundaries. And of course, that's even more so today with globalization and speeding up communications. Percy French and Charles Manners were good friends as students and collaborated together early on as musical entertainers in Negro disguise at a race meeting. Both were studying as engineers, not a profession in which either were really interested. As French put it, he left Trinity with an engineering degree, in his own words, quote, admirably unfitted for any profession whatever. And none of the great firms of the Industrial Revolution seemed able to find my address. He had already written an unsurpassed satirical ballad on the Eastern question and the rivalry between the equally moribund Ottoman and Tsarist empires, on which he neglected to copyright. Abdullah Almir, or at least I don't have the precise name, but roughly that. He spent several years in Cavan in the employment of the Board of Works, which inspired another great satirical ballad on Irish bureaucracy in Victorian times, and indeed all times, The Effusion of William, Inspector of Drains. The Jarvey was somewhat critical of Parnell in 1890-91, and in an updated version of the Shan van Vocht in reverse, presented a benign picture of the elderly Queen Victoria, who was anathema to separatists. Charles Manners was a precocious boy living in Portobello Barracks as a teenager, where his father was an officer. A cousin whose parents had emigrated to Germany in the early 1840s, and who was a Prussian officer who had fought in both the war against Austria in 1866 and the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, had to share a room with the future Charles Manners, and wrote home expressing his disgust with, quote, this stinking boy singing the whole time. Manners gave up engineering fairly quickly when he went for singing lessons and had an audition, as he recounted in the Jarvey, at the end of which he was asked, are you aware that you have £1,000 a year in your throat? He made his debut in the premiere of Iolanthe, the Gilbert and Sullivan satire on the Houses of Parliament, where he played the cameo role of Private Willis on night guard duty outside, who ruminates being something of an intellectual chap. When in that house MPs divide if they've got a brain and cerebellum too, they've got to leave that brain outside and vote just as their leaders tell them to. But then the prospects of a lot of dull MPs in close proximity, all thinking for themselves, is what no man can face with equanimity. In various opera companies after that, he played Dr. Bartolo in The Marriage of Figaro and the ghostly Commendatore in Don Giovanni, and he met the immensely talented chorus singer Fanny Moody on the Dublin-Belfast train and married her. And together they founded the financially very successful touring Moody Manners Opera Company in 1898. Manners stayed in touch with Percy French and brought a few of his watercolours. They performed, amongst other works, Maritana and the Lily of Killarney, as well as trying to encourage British opera. Manners was the British business manager, while she was the star performer, equally at home with Brunhilde, Gretchen in Gounod's Faust, or I Know My Redeemer Liveth from Handel's Messiah, performed in Belfast. Unfortunately, they retired in 1916, just before the age of recording began. In James Joyce's famous short story, The Dead, an opera evening is referenced, commented on somewhat critically by the fictional tenor Bartol D'Arcy. Research has established that while the story was written by Joyce on the Spanish steps in Rome in 1907, the Christmas season being described took place in 1903, when the company performing for the Gaiety at Christmas was Moody Manners. While the company was wound up during the First World War, the couple retired to a large house in Foxrock from the late 1920s called the Hermitage, which was sold 10 years later to the Little Sisters of the Poor. And I visited it earlier this year and was shown round by an elderly nun, and it still exists, not too much altered, but with other buildings added in the grounds, including a nursing home for 60 residents. In Ulysses, Leopold Bloom fantasizes about setting up the Tweedy Flower Grand Opera Company with an all-star Irish cast, his wife-born Marion Tweedy being a popular singer. This intended as a counterblast to Moody Manners, and which would tour English seaside resorts. Henry Flower being Bloom's pen name when conducting a clandestine correspondence with a young lady not his wife. It is fairly clear that Joyce wanted something more exclusively Irish. Outside my bedroom in Tipperary is a portrait of one of my great-great-great-grandmothers, Sophia Orpen, looking severe in Jane Austen period dress. I've also found a picture of a rural scene on a woodblock with written in chalk on the back, Sophia Orpen, 1798. William Orpen was an offshoot of the same family, and I was asked to open the National Gallery exhibition on his work back in 2006, as well as to give a lecture on him. And from the city branch of a Kerry-landed family, Orpen was an outstanding artist who worked both in Ireland and Britain up till the First World War, when he became an official war artist, albeit with a somewhat subversive approach to the task. He set off a security scare and wild goose chase with a portrait of a rather unclothed young lady who he mischievously suggested was a German spy, though she was nothing of the kind. Some versions of his picture of the Versailles Treaty negotiations in the Hall of Mirrors included ghostly figures of British soldiers who had lost their lives in the conflict. He did not feel it safe to come back to Ireland post-1918, though he continued to have Irish sitters in London, such as the long-serving principal of Alexandra College, Henrietta White, who, though a unionist, had briefly Patrick Pearse part-time and Dorothy McArdle, historian of the Irish Republic, on her staff. And Orpen was an important inspiration for Sean Keating, who has some claim to be regarded as the artist of the Irish Revolution and its aftermath, including the Shannon scheme. His brother, Richard Caulfield Orpen, was an illustrator of the Jarvie and a long-time fellow of St. Columba's College. He was primarily an ecclesiastical architect responsible for Dublin's 2 Protestant cathedrals and Trinity College, but also a watercolourist. In its obituary, the Columban Annual in 1938 recalled, quote, "The public of 40 years ago will recall with gratitude his collaboration with Mr. Percy French, his lightning sketches and the no less lightning humour with which he presented them while large audiences were spellbound." Among Sir William Orpen's portraits are one of his mistress and benefactor, Mrs. St. George. One of my collateral ancestors in the mid-18th century changed his name from the paternal one to the much grander St. George one of his mother, who was the natural daughter of a general but very rich. He was the subject of an exhibition in 2019 in the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, as he was both a cartoonist and a memorialist, as well as a soldier in the middle years of the American Revolution. One of the St. George mausoleums in County Galway, and the imagined prospect of a couple buried there of a Church of Ireland resurrection, is the subject of a poem of John Betjeman, typically irreverent, of course, to Ireland with Emily near the ruins of Tyrone House, County Galway. Attached to the British Embassy in Dublin in the early part of the war, he corresponded with my father, who worked then in the Ministry of Information, whom he called, or whom he addressed as Dear Dim Doctor, and I have one of his letters signed Sean O'Betchamoy. He was incidentally Cecil Day-Lewis's successor as poet laureate. He was besotted with decaying Anglo-Irish heritage. Another writer who straddled the Irish Sea was Elizabeth Bowen, who, at the suggestion of the Irish envoy in London, John Dulante, wrote reports on public opinion in Ireland during the war in return for freedom to travel between the two islands, at a time when she was writing and researching her family history, Bowen's Court. While regarding herself primarily as Irish, she had multiple identities, and according to my father's diary, Cousin Bitha, which is what he called her, was his third cousin. She had unrealized ambitions to become as great an English novelist as Jane Austen. To conclude, I had a brother-in-law, Dr. Paul Gilbert, a political philosopher at the University of Hull, who died early last year, making the case, which is now much more mainstream, for civic nationalism. I still admire cultural nationalism, provided it is not on an exclusive basis. One axiom of the decade of centenaries was that we should try and expand our sympathies without abandoning our loyalties. Emphasizing the distinctive and indigenous elements of Irish culture was necessary for fostering pride in an Irish identity, particularly in the early years of the state when there was less going for it. We have long since incorporated a broader approach and largely abandoned cultural protectionism, indeed our own version of the morality police, and pulled back what Lamass called the Green Curtain. We have a globalized economy and culture, but that does not mean that we should not emphasize our own contribution to it. Thankfully, we do not have a canon of Irish culture, nor a pantheon. Writers and artists are mostly reluctant to be herded into one ideological mold, and the Irish public have often silently made their own choices. The eventualities of constitutional evolution on this island, even if not imminent, will lead to further exploration of acceptable ways of enhancing compatibilities without attempting to cross a bridge too far. Different phases of our history and the extent of common cultural space and affinity shared across the island and with partner countries both near and afar will help us develop our adaptability to new challenges. And the spirit of Percy French will hopefully inoculate us against grandiose illusions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Martin Mansergh. That was the most fascinating thing. It's a topic I've spent my entire life being fascinated by. What does it mean to be Irish? On the basis that I'm half English and half Irish. And I was very much involved in the founding of the, well, sorry, I wasn't very much. I mean, I was involved in, sideways, with the Glencree Peace Centre, as you know, with Uno Malley O'Higgins, whose whole point was that sort of thing, identity. But I want a word that I think might greatly add to your work, is the use of the word typical. You are not, at the moment, a typical Irish person, in my view. I'm not a typical Irish person, despite the fact that a huge number of us in Ireland have joint identities from where we were born, why we were born, or things like that. Could we not add that word that, you know, even Oscar Wilde or somebody certainly wasn't a typical Irish person? That sort of idea would be useful, because when people say, is he really Irish? They say it about Jews, Protestants, people who are different. And they'll say it about black people too. Yeah. And everybody should find some word to describe what has until recently been the norm.
Well, I'll tell you one phrase I avoid. I remember I used to be a speechwriter for Charles Haughey, and obviously on some occasion I must have written a sentence which included the phrase ordinary people, and he said to me, there is no such thing as an ordinary person. And he's right. Everybody is different and individual, and all of us have mixed backgrounds. I mean, if you do a little mathematical calculation, say go back 300 years, I've been working a bit on my own family's history, as you probably gathered, we each have 500 ancestors. Now, okay, that may not be 500 different ancestors. They may double up in certain cases, reducing the total a little bit. Which is why genealogists don't have great difficulty, generally speaking, in finding Irish ancestors for any and every American president that might be elected. Mind you, I have a sneaky admiration for the small village in Germany where the Trump family came from a couple of hundred years ago, and they made it clear long ago that they hadn't the slightest interest in him going to visit them. But essentially, I agree with you, and I think that you will find that practically everybody has varied backgrounds. I mean, let's just take now, you might regard, at least with the benefit of hindsight, the 7 leaders of the 1916 Rising, can anybody be more typically Irish men anyway than those 7? 5 of them had either Protestant spouses or a Protestant parent. I mentioned Tom Clark, who's was a Protestant soldier from County Leitrim. And so they were, and Pierce actually certainly admitted to his sister, who wrote a little memoir on the subject, that he was the product of 2 cultures, and so on. So I think you can take it, and I mean, you had King George V giving out about his Spanish Prime Minister in Dublin, Eamon de Valera and so on. So, I mean, the reality is that people, for a long time, perhaps were inclined to suppress, less conventional parts of their background. I mean, I'll give you the classic example is from about the late 1990s, leading Republicans, Sinn Féin, RA, suddenly discovered and suddenly found it was acceptable to reveal the fact that they had had great uncles that had fought in the First War, in the Great War. And Martin McGuinness, I know, because he told me so, approved the building of the Messine Tower, which was, of course, built by working class lads from both loyalist and Republican backgrounds, mainly in Derry. And one of the last things he did in 2016, before he died, was unveil a bust of Francis Ledwidge, who was a poet soldier in the trenches, but who had written a famous poem about Lament for Thomas and Thomas MacDonagh. So he crossed. So I mean, I think all of us, we all need to resist, if we can, people love to pigeonhole other people, with a sort of a short description. I mean, we're all complex. There are contradictions in our attitudes. We blow hot and cold on different things, and so on. And I've come to the sort of vaguely Hegelian conclusion